Hello, hello. This is Dr. Mandic, and welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This is Lecture 4. It is our first lecture about ethics. First of 4 lectures that are going to be all about ethics. And in this first one, I want to do 4 things. The first thing we're going to do is talk a bit about norms. One way of thinking about what ethics is all about is to say that ethics is all about norms, or you might say ethics is all about normativity. Most of the lecture is going to be about points 2, 3, and 4, though. We're going to talk about, after talking about norms, we're going to talk about something called egoism. We're going to talk about something called social relativism. And we're going to talk about divine command theory. And divine command theory is something that we talked a little bit about already, especially in lecture 2. Okay, so let's jump into norms. What are norms? Well, one way of thinking about norms is to think about language that talks about norms, talk about normative language, and it will help us to think about language that involves ethical norms and language that involves non-ethical norms. Let's start with non-ethical norms. Throughout this whole video, I want you to be thinking about what the difference is between ethics and things that are similar to ethics but not really ethics. So here are some non-ethical norms, and they are illustrated by some sentences in which we might use normative language. The normative language is highlighted. So, for example, the word should is highlighted in this sentence. Jim is deciding whether he should invest his money in gold bullion, mutual funds, or government bonds. So that's normative language. We're talking about what Jim should do, but it's not really an ethical sense of the word should. It's more of a practical sense of the word should. Vanessa is the star of our next sentence. Vanessa wonders whether it is permissible for her to turn right on red in this state. So this is a legal norm. We're talking about what's permissible, but not in the ethical sense of permissible, but in the legal sense. Distinguishing between ethics and the law is a very important thing to do, especially if you want to criticize the law. There are some states, at least at some times, in which maybe the laws are actually unethical. If ethics and the law are just the same thing, then what I just said doesn't make any sense at all. On the other hand, if you think it does make sense that you could criticize the law, you could evaluate the law to see whether the law is a good law or a bad law, then obviously it would have to be the case that ethics and the law are two different sorts of things. So there's lots of times in which we might say something is permissible or instead forbidden. And what we're just talking about are the laws of the land. We're not really talking about ethics. So is it unethical to run a red light? How about if it's really, really late at night and you know there's no traffic for miles and miles? Are you just going to sit at a red light and wait for it to turn? Or are you just going to go on through it knowing that you're completely safe, you're not going to hurt anybody, and you're not going to get a ticket? Do you just go for it? Is that against the law? Well, technically, at least in that part of the country. But is it unethical? You might say, well, ethics has got nothing to do with it. Here's another sentence. Todd is debating whether he ought to put more cinnamon in his ginger snaps. Ginger snaps are kind of cookie, and they are delicious. And perhaps Todd ought to put more cinnamon in his ginger snaps. Why? Well, because they taste better that way. Now, would it be immoral if he decided not to put more cinnamon in it? No, that's not what we mean by ought in this context. Sometimes we use the word ought to refer to ethical norms, but other times we're talking about other norms like aesthetic norms, norms about beauty or norms about how to make things that taste good. Another kind of norm is illustrated in our 4th sentence here. Sue is considering whether she filled out her taxes correctly. Did she follow the rules is really what we're talking about here. These are norms of reasonableness, or maybe another example of legality. again, not really ethical. Um, did she put her first name in the box for your last name? If so, she filled the form out incorrectly. Was that unethical to make that kind of mistake? Was it a moral mistake? No, it was not unethical. It was just maybe going against the directions. She didn't follow the instructions correctly. So anyway, those are non-ethical norms. What are ethical norms? Well, examples of ethical norms have to do with, first and foremost, matters of life and death, like drop kicking babies. That's probably not very helpful to the baby. Um, Probably it's safe to say that everyone would see that it's obvious that not only is there a norm against drop kicking babies, but that norm is an ethical norm. It is unethical, or in other words, immoral, to drop kick babies. It might also be against the law, but the law is there because it's unethical. It's not the other way around. It's not unethical because it's against the law. We've created the law that way because we recognize that it's unethical. You might also say that it's impractical to drop kick babies. If you go around drop kicking babies, then you're going to wind up in jail, and that might really ruin your plans for the weekend. Okay, but there's more to it than that, and that something more is what we're trying to get at in distinguishing ethics and ethical norms from these other sorts of norms. Another kind of life or death question of ethical norms is the question that we pose in the trolley problem. This is something that we already discussed a little bit in an earlier lecture. Are you ethically obligated to pull the lever? We think it's obvious that you're ethically obligated to refrain from drop kicking babies, but are you ethically obligated to pull that lever? If you don't pull the lever, the trolley is going to kill 5 people. If you do pull the lever, well, you're going to save those 5 people, but in one way or another, you've killed that single person over on this track here. So what are you ethically obligated to do? Again, we're talking about norms, and we're specifically talking about ethical norms here. Not all ethical norms are about matters of life and death, although some are. Here's some other examples of ethical norms. So your best friend's boyfriend or girlfriend has gone or had 1 beer too many and is coming on to you at the party. If you can get away with it, should you hook up with him or her? Should you cheat on your girlfriend or boyfriend? That's an ethical question, and it has to do with ethical norms. Your friend Shauna knows how to pirate new release movies and wants to show you how. Should you go with her and get some flicks? Well, this is a kind of stealing. Is that ethical? You might say there's nothing ethically wrong with it. That's fine, but you at least are talking about ethical norms, and that's the main point right here. Here's some life and death. Your grandmother is dying of terminal pancreatic cancer and has only a few and painful days to live. She is begging you to give her a lethal overdose of morphine, which will depress her respiration and allow her to die peacefully. So your grandmother is asking you to kill her. You might say that generally you have an ethical obligation to not kill people, and you might want to not kill your grandmother regardless. Even if you were into killing people, you might not want to kill her. But how about under these circumstances? Are you obligated to do it? Are you permitted to do it? What if it was against the law? Would you feel like that you had to do it anyway? These are questions of ethical norms. Here's one more example. You are a pregnant, unmarried student. Testing has shown that your fetus has Down syndrome. Should you get an abortion? Again, this is kind of a life or death situation, and it's an ethical situation. It's dealing with ethical norms. A lot of these examples are cases in which you might not know what to do. You might spend a lot of time wrestling with it. Like, other people might say, well, it's obvious that you should go ahead and get an abortion. Other people might say it's obvious that you shouldn't. But still other people, and maybe you're one of them, said it's not obvious what to do. It's a really hard question. And you might not know what the answer is. But one really big question is, well, how are you going to figure it out? Are you just going to flip a coin? Or are you going to just go with your gut instinct? Or are you just going to do what's easiest and most convenient for you? Or are you going to put a lot of thought into it to try to figure out what the ethically right thing is to do in these situations? So one general sort of question we could ask is, how do you make these sorts of decisions? Do you base your action on your gut instinct or your intuitions or your sympathies and your feelings? That's one kind of approach, a kind of like go with your gut or go with what feels right approach. But there's a second sort of approach whereby you would base your action on some rule, code, or set of principles. Which of these two approaches do you think of yourself as using? Which one would you use in the sorts of examples we've been discussing so far? And another question I want you to think about is which one of these is more philosophical? Is it more philosophical to base your action on your gut instinct, etc.? Or is it instead more philosophical to base your action on some rule or code or principles? Well, which of these is more philosophical? One thing you might think is that given the definition of philosophy as emphasizing so much reason, that number two is the one that is more philosophical, because if we're talking about, for example, rules or principles, those seem to have a lot more to do with reasons. Or you might put it like this: going on your gut instincts or your feelings is kind of more emotional, and that's the opposite of reason, which is much more intellectual. So you might say, like, well, I don't want to be philosophical. I want to do things along the lines of number one. That's fine. That's your choice. Nonetheless, you're taking a class here on philosophy, so you're going to learn about how to do things along with number two. That's the philosophical way of doing things. So various philosophical approaches to ethics are trying to figure out something like rules or principles that don't just boil down to the rule of law, but somehow transcend legality, or somehow go above and beyond them, or more basic or fundamental. And that relates to another part of our definition of philosophy, the part that focuses on things that are fundamental. So it is important to know what the law is, and in many cases to obey the law, but nonetheless you might want to know about the fundamentals of the law. And often the fundamentals are going to boil down to something ethical. The law is grounded, hopefully, in ethics, and the law of the place where you live is overall an ethical law. All right, let's look at our first study question. There's going to be a few study questions in this video, and here's the first one. Study question number one. Which of the following has to do with norms? A, Shauna is wondering if she ought to share her quiz answers. B, Larry doesn't think it's right to cheat on your taxes. C, although it's gross, technically it's permissible to pick your nose in class. So in A, B, and C, we've got highlighted words: ought, right, and permissible. So which of these has to do with norms? Is it just A? Is it just B? Is it just C? Or is it D, all of the above? Or is it E, none of the above? Well, that's all I want to say right now in general about what norms are and how you would distinguish between ethical norms versus non-ethical norms. But I do want you to keep in mind that distinction between things that are kind of similar to ethics, like, for example, the law, versus ethics itself, which is something that is more fundamental than the law and government. What we're going to do for most of the video is to focus on these last approaches to ethics: egoism, social relativism, and divine command theory. And one of the things I'm going to emphasize is perhaps a little bit controversial in philosophy, but nonetheless I think will help us organize our thoughts about this. And that is the way in which all three of these positions, egoism, social relativism, and divine command theory, are in some important sense relativistic. They are making morality relative to something. So egoism, we're going to see that it makes morality relative to the individual. It makes morality and right and wrong just relative to you. And similarly, it could be relative to me, and that would mean that you and I could have completely different moralities. And further, we're both correct. That's egoism. It's not simply that you and I have different views about morality, but that both of us are right, even if we have different views. So there's your morality, there's my morality, and there's Joe's morality, and there's Shauna's morality, and each of us is right, and there's no objective fact apart from our individual preferences. So that's egoism, and it's about the individual. It's relativistic because it makes morality relative to the individual. And then we're going to talk about something called social relativism. And when people talk about relativism in ethics, they're usually talking about social relativism, in part because egoism is so crazy that no one spends much time taking it seriously. But they're both kinds of relativism. The difference between egoism and social relativism is basically the difference between how many people we're talking about. So social relativism is the view that morality is relative to groups of individuals. It's making morality relative to societies. So it isn't enough if one person has a moral view to make it right. But as long as they have enough people to count as a group, and who knows how many that is, 2, 3, is that enough for a group? You can make a little society out of just 4 people. Well, whatever. If you've got a society, then you've got enough people to make a moral truth. And as long as those people agree, then it's true for them. And if there's another group that has a different view, well, their view is correct also. So we've got 2 different kinds of relativism: egoism, which makes morality relative to the individual, and social relativism that makes morality relative to the social. Probably the weirdest thing to cram into the relativistic box is divine command theory. A lot of people talk about these ethical theories in terms of what's universal to humans versus what varies across humans. And with divine command theory, at least as humans go, we have an allegedly universal approach to ethics. Divine command theory, which we talked quite a bit about in lecture 2, divine command theory makes ethics or morality relative to the will of God, or if there are multiple gods, the will of the gods. So it's universal in the sense that the humans are universally have to abide by this one morality. They maybe aren't members of that religion, but they're wrong to do so from the point of view of that religion. But nonetheless, it's a kind of relativism. You just have a special kind of individual. In egoism and social relativism, any old human being, any old being has some kind of say-so in what counts as right and wrong. In divine command theory, you have to be a divine being. But nonetheless, it's a kind of relativism. We're making morality relative to someone's will. We're making morality, in some sense, a matter of opinion. It's just that there's an opinion that matters most of all, and that's the opinion of God or the gods. But a lot of what's problematic about egoism and social relativism is also problematic of divine command theory. But let's say more about egoism. We'll start there. So this begins part 2 of the video, egoism. So the basic idea of egoism is it's a kind of selfishism. It makes being selfish good. So we might say that according to egoism, morality is just whatever you believe it is. So whatever you believe is guaranteed to be true. It's true for you, but that's truth enough according to egoism. This allows that everyone can have his or her own morality. It's not simply saying that everyone has his or her own opinion, but it's further saying that everyone's opinion is right. It's true. It's correct. One famous example of an egoist is Ayn Rand. Many people may have encountered Ayn Rand in discussions of politics and economics. Anyway, her philosophy, which she calls objectivism, is really better thought of as a kind of egoism, which is not objective at all. It's really actually subjective. It makes each subject the determiner of what's right and wrong. So the way Ayn Rand would put it is that the achievement of his own happiness is man's highest purpose. So look out for number 1 and notice her jewelry. She's wearing the dollar sign. Got to get those dollars. So one way of thinking about egoism as a kind of relativism is to go back to our example of drop kicking a baby. So some people might think this is terrible. Well, okay, so according to him, it's terrible. Therefore, it's wrong for him to drop kick babies, and he will not drop kick babies. She thinks it's wonderful. Well, she's right too. She loves it when a baby is drop kicked, and she's right. It's good for her, and so therefore it's good. So egoism allows that it's okay to drop kick babies as long as you think it's wonderful to drop kick babies. If, on the other hand, you think it's terrible to drop kick babies, then you ought not to drop kick a baby. But there's no deeper matter to right and wrong besides personal opinion. Now, one thing you should ask yourself is, are you an egoist? Do you really think this way? And it's not simply a question of, do you just do whatever you feel like doing? But the question is just doing what you feel like doing ethically okay? Is that fine? Or is it possible that doing whatever you feel like doing is actually kind of being a bad person if you act that way? Let's consider, since it's a philosophy class, what possible argument there might be for egoism. Lots of people might decide that they want to be egoists because sounds like fun. As long as you can stomach killing someone, there's nothing really wrong with it. As long as you're enjoying it, you're having a good time. Who cares if it causes other people to suffer? You're having the time of your life, taking a life. What possible argument could there be for egoism? Well, one sort of argument starts with an idea that relates normative language like ought to language concerning possibility. So there's what you ought to do, and then there's what you can do, and vice versa. If something was impossible for you, it wouldn't make sense to say that you're obligated to do it. So consider this. Consider that someone just slipped and fell into a swimming pool, and they don't know how to swim, and they're drowning. And this is happening right now, but it's happening in California, and you are thousands of miles away from California. Are you obligated to try to save this person? You can't possibly fly over to California fast enough to help them out. Let's also suppose that you don't even know that they have slipped and drowned, or they have slipped or are in the process of drowning. So it would be impossible for you to save them. Would we say that you did something wrong by not saving them? I think probably what people would agree is that you're not morally obligated to do this thing, since you couldn't possibly do it. You're only morally obligated to do something if it's also true that you're able to do it. So this is a general principle that many philosophers accept that says that ought implies can. If it's true that you ought to do something, then it follows that you're able to do it. That's going to be the first premise of this argument for egoism. The second premise says the only things I can do are things I'm motivated to do. So I just can't do something unless I have some kind of motive to do it. And you might say, well, you could fall down, and one way you could fall down is if someone pushed you down. Well, that's the sense in which I'm not actually doing it. I'm not really the one doing the falling. Instead, the falling is something that's happening to me. But if we took another example, like, okay, I'm drinking from my water bottle, that's an action. That's something that I'm doing voluntarily. And what it means for it to be an action or something that I'm doing voluntarily is that I have a motive for doing that, and further, the motive is causing me to drink the water. So only things I can do in the sense of action, voluntary action, are things that I have a motive to do. That's the second premise. Third premise, ultimately the only things I'm motivated to do are things that increase my own pleasure, or we might say things that increase the ratio of my pleasure over my pain, my own pleasure to pain ratio. And so we take these three premises, and from them we conclude, therefore, the only things that I ought to do are those that maximize my own pleasure to pain ratio. Well, it's an argument. Is it a good argument? Is it a valid argument? Is it a sound argument? One of the things in evaluating this argument that it's useful to point out is the difference between two different things that are worth calling egoism, only one of which are really the conclusion of that argument. So it's important to note a distinction between what sometimes gets referred to as psychological egoism and ethical egoism. So psychological egoism is a proposition that is attempting to make a statement about how people's psychology works. It is stating that everyone always acts in his or her own self-interest. In contrast, ethical egoism is something making an explicitly normative claim. It's got the word should in it, saying everyone should always act in his or her own self-interest. So both of these sentences are about acting in your self-interest, but only one of them is saying that you should act that way. The psychological egoism is saying, as a matter of fact, everyone acts that way. But it leaves open, it would seem, whether everyone ought to act that way. Ethical egoism is asserting that separate thing, which is everyone ought to act that way. Another way of wording psychological egoism and ethical egoism is like this. Psychological egoism is stating that everyone actually acts in his or her own self-interest, whereas ethical egoism is stating that everyone ought to always act in his or her own self-interest. And I guess I want to get rid of the always there, or maybe add it in both cases. I'm trying to make psychological egoism and ethical egoism seem the same, except for these two words here, ought and actually. And I hope you can appreciate that there's a big difference between what ought to be true and what actually is true. So you ought to go to, you ought to study for your classes. You ought to be nice to people. But are you always actually doing what you ought to be doing? Probably not. No one is perfect. This is an illustration of what philosophers famously call the distinction between what is and what ought to be. This is the distinction between is and ought. Psychological egoism is making a statement about what is, and ethical egoism is making a statement about ought. We might appreciate also that psychological egoism is making an a posteriori claim, whereas ethical egoism is making a claim that perhaps you can't settle by a purely a posteriori methodology. So I want us to recognize that this argument for egoism has psychological egoism as the third premise and ethical egoism as the conclusion. And so one thing you should wonder is, whenever you're evaluating an argument, you're wondering, is this argument any good? Is you should wonder, do the premises logically necessitate the truth of the conclusion? If so, then the argument is valid. On the other hand, if it's possible for these premises to all be true, but the conclusion still doesn't follow, then the argument is invalid. It's in some sense not a good argument. So let's think about this. Is this argument a valid argument? Does 1, 2, and 3 logically necessitate the conclusion? That's the question of whether the argument is valid. Then there's also the question of whether the argument is sound, and that has to do with things like, are all the parts true? So you might wonder, even if this argument was valid, is, for example, the third premise true? Is it really true that everyone is motivated to seek their own pleasure, or that everyone is motivated to seek the maximization of their pleasure to pain ratio? Is that really true? Even if this is a valid argument, that third premise might be false, and if so, it's still not really a good argument. In some sense, it's a bad argument. So let's take some of these things in turn. Is psychological egoism true? Is it really true that everyone acts in their own self-interest? Well, there are a couple different examples that would seem to indicate that psychological egoism is actually false. There are examples in which people sacrifice themselves. There are real-life examples in which, for example, someone throws themselves on a grenade in order to save their fellow soldiers. It is in their self-interest to not be blown to bits by a grenade, but nonetheless they sacrifice their life to help save the lives of others. So that would seem to contradict psychological egoism. There's also psychological evidence that people that have children are overall less happy than people that don't have kids. But nonetheless, people, myself included, go ahead and have children. So that would seem to argue against psychological egoism too. Lots of people do things contrary to what's in their self-interest. Now you might say about at least cases like number 2, maybe people didn't know that. They didn't realize that it was against their self-interest. And you might modify psychological egoism to say something like, people act to maximize what they think is in their self-interest. But that wouldn't really deal with case number 1. When you throw yourself on a grenade, I don't think you think there's going to be, it's somehow in your self-interest, do you? And you might say, well, maybe you wanted to be famous, or maybe you wanted to get into heaven. Or maybe just really, it makes you happy thinking that your friends are going to have their lives saved. And so therefore it is your self-interest. There's a worry here now that we're bending what counts as self-interest. If you're just redefining having a motive as acting in your self-interest, then it's kind of a trivial thing to try to defend. You're just winning the argument by definition, and that doesn't seem very interesting. So that was a discussion of psychological egoism, but how about ethical egoism? Is ethical egoism true? Well, one of the most obvious objections to ethical egoism is just it seems to lead to things that are just so completely horrible. And if you're interested in ethics and you're trying to be a good person, it would just seem to follow that you wouldn't really take ethical egoism seriously. And if you were the kind of person who just was going to do whatever they wanted and you didn't care what other people thought about that, what's the point of dressing it up by calling it ethical? Like, if you're going to be a serial murderer, just go do it. Like, why are you going to say, like, oh, by the way, it is ethical to do this? So the horribleness of what gets permitted on ethical egoism seems to really count very strongly against it. Another thing that seems to make ethical egoism really unsatisfying is the way in which it makes ethics merely subjective. It makes ethics instead a mere matter of subjective taste. Now, this is a really interesting thing to think about and kind of hard to settle. One way of getting at what's going on here and trying to figure out whether you agree with it or not is to ask in general, which things do you think are objective and which things do you think are instead subjective? And does ethics seem more like the objective things or the subjective things? So here's an example of something that I think a lot of people would say is objective. So think about physical objects, like, for example, marbles. Remember the story of the false belief task and the story of Sally and Anne from an earlier video? So while Sally was out playing, Anne moved Sally's marble from Sally's basket and put it in Anne's box. And we asked the question, where's Sally going to look for the marble? And everyone appreciates that Sally believes that the marble is still in the basket, even though in reality the marble is no longer in the basket. Well, saying that in some sense is saying that marbles and their locations, that's something that's objective. There's an objective fact of the matter about where the marble is. Just because Sally believes the marble is in the basket, it doesn't make it true that the marble is in the basket. Where the marble is objective. It's not something that's subjective. So we might say things like space and matter are objective. They exist independently of the mind. They exist outside of the mind. In contrast, consider aesthetic qualities like beauty. So here are two creatures. There's a human being and there's a vulture. And even if you don't find the human being attractive, probably you would agree that the human being is more beautiful than the vulture, although maybe you disagree. I bet if you were a vulture, you would probably agree that the vulture is more beautiful than the human being. And these sorts of considerations make people think that beauty is not objective. It seems like beauty would probably be subjective. That maybe a human being would think that the human model is hot and the vulture is not hot. And if you asked a vulture, they would, if a vulture could talk, they would give an opposite answer. The vulture might say, you know, this human being, like their beak is too small and they have too much hair on their head. They're really ugly. And their eyes are in the front of their face instead of the side of their head. And they're just not red enough. But if you look at this creature down here, hubba hubba, that's just really an attractive creature. Look at that powerful beak. So you might appreciate that, like, yeah, beauty has to do with things that are related to, like, sexual attraction. And a vulture needs to be sexually attracted to other vultures. And so, of course, a vulture is going to think of another vulture as much more beautiful than a human being. What's a human being going to do for a vulture? At least while they're still alive. A vulture might eat you after you're dead, but not because you're beautiful. So this is to make a statement that we could call the relativism about beauty. We're saying that beauty is relative in a way that where the marble was is not relative. Where the marble was is objective. It's not subjective. Now, one thing that we're going to talk about in a later lecture when we get into the metaphysics of space is whether maybe even space and location and material objects are relative after all. And some of you might be familiar with Einstein's relativity theory. But like, you know, like I'll say, philosophy is complicated. Okay, so the point of this discussion is to illustrate some ideas. Maybe you don't agree with the ideas, but we're at least illustrating the ideas. And the idea is that there are some things that are objective, like probably a lot of people would say where the marble is objective. Merely believing it doesn't make it true. But when it comes to beauty, maybe believing it does make it true. Like if you really, really like to look at vultures, even though no one else does, well, then for you it's beautiful, and there's nothing more to say about beauty than what opinions people have when they look at things. So which thing is ethics more like? The claim that it's wrong to dropkick babies? Is it more like beauty, it's in the eye of the beholder, or is it more like the location of material objects? There's an objective fact of the matter, and your beliefs don't make it true. A lot of people are going to say that it's obvious that at least some things are just objectively wrong, and that's why egoism is itself a bad approach to ethics. And a very similar sort of thing is going to be said about social relativism. But let's move on and talk about social relativism. Social relativism is kind of like egoism, only with more people in it. We're talking about groups of people instead of individual one-by-one people. Just like we had a distinction between psychological egoism and ethical egoism, we're going to have a similar sort of distinction when it comes to social relativism. There's descriptive social relativism, which is making a claim about what actually happens, versus moral relativism, which is making a claim about what ought to happen. And we should be reminded of something that was said earlier in connection with egoism, is that this makes us think of the very famous and important distinction between is and ought. So back when we were talking about egoism and psychological egoism versus ethical egoism, psychological egoism is making a claim about what is the case, where ethical egoism is making a claim about what ought to be the case. And so similarly, when we look over here, we're comparing two kinds of social relativism, descriptive relativism and moral relativism. We're really, again, engaging with the distinction between is and ought. Descriptive relativism is saying that beliefs about morality and the values that people possess vary across cultures divided by times and places. So descriptive relativism is attempting to describe what really happens with societies. It's saying that as a matter of fact, societies have all sorts of different beliefs about morality. Moral relativism is making an extra step in making a claim about what ought to be the case. It is saying that what ought to be the case is determined by what people believe in their societies. The truth of moral claims and which values people should adopt vary across cultures divided by times and places. What is morally permissible in one culture may be morally wrong in another culture. So it's not just saying that people have different beliefs about what's permissible and what's wrong, but that those beliefs are true in the one culture and relative to the other culture, those beliefs are false. But let's talk about this. Are these different kinds of relativism actually true? So is it really true, starting with descriptive relativism, that there's widespread disagreement about ethics? Now, maybe you can find widespread disagreement about some ethical matters, like relatively minor things, but like really big things, like is it okay to torture someone to death for entertainment purposes? I think all cultures are going to say that that's wrong. There might be cultural differences about, like, is it okay to kill someone in self-defense? Maybe there's going to be some groups that say, like, you should never kill in self-defense. You should always just be a pacifist. Others will allow that it's okay to kill in self-defense. Maybe some cultures will differ about whether abortion counts as murder. But like, if we took a full-grown, healthy adult and tortured them to death for no other reason besides that it would just be entertaining to do that, I don't think any culture would endorse that. So that seems to speak against descriptive relativism. Arguably, there's all sorts of things that are ethically universal, that all cultures agree that to some degree it's good to help other people. All cultures are going to have injunctions against incest and against just indiscriminately, like for no reason, killing people. There's going to be some kind of duties of care, especially towards children, in all cultures. And you might say this makes good sense. Like, imagine a culture in which they just killed all the children. How long would that culture be around for? Like, they wouldn't last, they wouldn't make it past the first generation. So you might say that, as a matter of fact, the existence of cultures depends on some kind of morality, and morality is a product of a kind of natural selection. It's evolution that leads to at least some kind of basic morality across all cultures. If they didn't observe that morality, they just wouldn't exist anymore. But here's a really important question. Why would descriptive relativism lead to moral relativism? Even if descriptive relativism is true, why would moral relativism follow? So even if it was true that all sorts of different cultures have different beliefs about morality, why should we allow that they are all true? Why can't it nonetheless be the case that some of them have correct beliefs about morality and others have false beliefs about morality? So here's an analogy. Many cultures believed that the Earth is at the center of the universe, while others went on to conclude that the sun is at the center, or at least that the sun is at the center of the solar system, at the whatever, that the Earth's not at the center. So there has been cultural disagreement, at least at some points in history, about the relative position of the Earth relative to the sun. Which one, if any, is at the center? Now, does the mere fact that there's cultural disagreement there lead you to conclude that that is the end of the story, that there's no objective fact in the matter? Another way of putting the general point here is, does it always follow that if there's disagreement, then there's no objectivity? It seems not. It seems that even though there's disagreement, there could be objectivity. The mere fact that there's disagreement shouldn't make you say that it's, in any sense, subjective. So, if this is true about astronomical bodies, why shouldn't then it be true about moral statements, that you could have objectivity even though there's disagreement? One of the biggest objections that gets raised in connection with moral relativism, or what I'm calling social relativism, is the criticism objection. We think that in a lot of cases it makes sense to allow that there can be such a thing as criticizing a practice, of criticizing a culture. And one way you might put this is in terms of other cultures, that there's certain cases in which you want to be able to say, like, yes, what this other culture is doing is wrong. And one way we could put that idea in the form of an argument is like this. So premise one, if moral relativism is true, then criticizing the practices of other cultures is incoherent. It wouldn't even make sense. However, premise two says criticizing the practices of other cultures is not incoherent. It is instead coherent, or in other words, it makes sense to be able to do that. So therefore, moral relativism is false. Now, this way of putting the argument is something that we might illustrate in terms of a joke. So here's a little cartoon comic strip about moral relativism. So there's a little cartoon character, and he says, I'm tired of people judging me based on their objective ethical standards. Ethical relativism is obviously the way to go. And then his friend shows up and says, hey, Nestor, what do you got going on today? And he says, I was thinking of heading down to the playground and beating up some kids and stealing their lunches. Want to come? Doesn't that strike you as a little bit unethical? And then he says, maybe for you, but I've decided that each person has to decide for themselves what is right. Mugging kids may be wrong for you, but it works for me. Don't judge me. And then the green guy says, so when we have disagreements over things like mugging kids, how are we supposed to resolve them? How do we decide who's right? And blue guy says, well, that's the great thing. We don't have to decide who's right because we both are. We are both doing what's right for us. So don't judge me. And the green guy says, well, maybe I've decided that the right thing for me is to be judgmental of jerks who beat up kids and steal their food. And the blue guy says, no, you're not listening. Criticizing other people's moral systems is wrong. Stop judging me. So it's a philosophical joke, so maybe that's why you don't think it's that funny. But nonetheless, it's making a point that's interesting. And that is, some people might be motivated to adopt relativism because they don't like the idea of other people judging them. So they want to avoid anyone judging anybody. But now what happens when someone comes along and judges you? Do you complain? Do you say, no, it's not right to judge? I'm trying to be a relativist. You're not being a good relativist if you're judging others. Well, that seems to go against relativism. If relativism is true, then as long as your culture says relativism is false, then relativism is false. So you can't complain if someone judges you. It's okay. Anyway, there's no explaining humor. I thought it was funny. Let's go back to the criticism objection. So one way of putting the criticism objection is about criticizing other cultures. If it makes sense to criticize the practices of other cultures, then that would seem to show that moral relativism is wrong. It doesn't have to be emphasized in terms of other cultures, though. We can make the same sort of point about your own culture. So we got a slightly different first premise here. If moral relativism is true, then criticizing the practices of any cultures, including your own, is incoherent. So if your own culture was doing something that you thought was immoral, then how could you possibly criticize it? You couldn't say that it was immoral. All you would have to do, if moral relativism is true, is say, oh, my culture says it's okay, so I guess it's okay. And it doesn't matter if what it says is that I should get tortured to death. I can't complain. I just got to say, oh, whatever the culture says. But if instead you think that it does make sense for there to be some kind of moral criticism, then that would just blow moral relativism right out of the water. So one very serious and tragic example that people discuss in connection with moral relativism is a practice in which people people that have female genitals are purposely subjected to mutilation. This is sometimes referred to as female circumcision, and it is a very painful procedure and one might say very disfiguring. So if there are some places in the world, like for example certain regions of Central America, in which people practice female genital mutilation, that's what FGM stands for, then relative to those groups, there's nothing wrong with it. And if there's places like, for example, the United States where no one practices female genital mutilation, then it is wrong in the United States. It's right in Central America, or I'm sorry, Central Africa. But are you a relativist? If you are inclined to say no, it's just wrong regardless of where it's happening, it doesn't matter if there's certain people that are in favor of it, it's just wrong, then you are not a relativist. One kind of worry that people might have about rejecting moral relativism is that this seems to lead to a kind of disrespect for cultures. A lot of times when we think about critiquing, we think of it in terms of respect. It's disrespectful to criticize people, right? Like if you just went up to somebody at a party and said, your clothes are terrible, you're criticizing them, you're being really critical, and people think you're a jerk, and perhaps rightly so. It's not really a great thing to say when you're at a party. Nonetheless, there are certain cases in which it makes sense to criticize. It makes sense to speak out and call out injustices. And sometimes those injustices are happening not just in your own culture, they're happening in some other culture. So how is it possible to reject moral relativism and nonetheless have a respect for other cultures? And one way to do it is to think of those other cultures as, in some sense, dignified. And we respect the dignity of people when we criticize them. We are saying that they are honest and interested in the truth, and we are helping them be led to the truth. So if instead of criticizing them, we just blew them up, then that would be a failure of respect. But it's a sign of respect to, instead of just going to war with them and destroying them, we try to have a conversation with them. And in that conversation, we try to reason with them. So even though in reasoning we might say things that are negative, it's nonetheless respectful because we are treating them as reasonable people and we are presenting them with reasons. And we're trying to give them reasons for seeing that their behaviors are incorrect behaviors. And in doing so, we are also open to the fact that maybe we are wrong. We're sitting down to the table to have a reasoned discussion with them. That means we ourselves happen to be open to reasons and the possibility that maybe that we are wrong. This is something that can happen with perfect respect across the disagreement. So the point here is that you can have respect for other cultures without having to adopt some kind of moral relativism. Okay, let's say a little bit about divine command theory, even though this is something that was talked about quite a bit in Lecture 2. So I'm going to be approaching this from the point of view of just doing a little bit of review, and mostly here focusing on the way in which divine command theory is a kind of relativism. So recall that divine command theory, or what we might call theological ethics, makes morality based on the gods or God. One way we can put it is the way we put it in number 3 here: God's love makes things good. Or we might put it in terms of the law, that there's a sense in which in divine command theory, ethics is legality, but it's not the legality of earthly governments. It's the law as written by God. So God is the divine lawgiver. God is laying down the law. Now, what makes the, for example, the 10 Commandments true? Why is it true that you should not kill people? Why is it true that you should not tell lies? Well, the answer to that question is because God said so. And you might ask, well, why did God say so? And there's no further answer to that question. You can't say God said so because it's the right thing to do. That would contradict divine command theory. Divine command theory is saying good and bad comes from God. It's created by God. One of the most important, at least in the history of philosophy, ways of putting this point is one that comes from the philosopher Plato, and it gets referred to as the Euthyphro objection, or sometimes it gets called the Euthyphro dilemma. As we talked about in Lecture 2, Plato wrote a lot of dialogues. One of his most famous dialogues is called the Euthyphro. All of his dialogues starred the philosopher Socrates, who is Plato's teacher. And in the Euthyphro, Socrates is talking to this other character, Euthyphro, and they're talking about right and wrong, and Euthyphro is advocating a kind of divine command theory. He's saying he's doing something because it pleases the gods. That's what makes it the right thing to do, is that it's pleasing to the gods. And Socrates asked this question, like, well, why is it pleasing to the gods? If it's pleasing to the gods because it's good, then the answer to the question why it's good can't just be because the gods say so, and then that just destroys divine command theory. So it gets put like this. Are things good because God loves them, or does God love them because they are good? Asking this question is to pose a dilemma. Either things are good because God loves them, or God loves them because they are good. So this is just logically true. It's either got to be one way or the other. And this all adds up to an objection, because regardless of whether one is true or two is true, that's supposed to lead to some kind of unacceptable problems. What's the problem that one leads to, and what's the problem that two leads to? Well, if it's true that things are good because God loves them, well, that seems to make you think that God is irrational. Well, why is God irrational? Well, because there's no reason for why he loves them. Normally when people give reasons for why they love something, like, why do I love water? Well, I have a reason for it, because it quenches thirst. I don't simply love it. I don't just decide, okay, water is great. I think it's great for certain reasons. So it's got to be great independently of my liking it. I like it because it's got these things that pre-exist me, and I recognize that it has those things. But that wouldn't apply in situation number one. So how about situation number two? God loves them because they're good. Well, now what counts as good is independent of God. And so God isn't really making morality anymore on this option. So we went over that in a bit more detail in Lecture 2, and you might go back and review that. So I want to start wrapping things up. We're getting towards the end of this video. Before we finish, let's have two more study questions. So we already had study question number 1 earlier in the video. Here's study question number 2. According to the criticism objection, if moral relativism is right, then A, we can't coherently criticize the morality of other cultures. B, we can't coherently criticize the morality of our own culture. C, we can't have any morality at all. D, both A and B. E, none of the above. So that was study question 2, and here's study question 3. The main difference between ethical egoism and psychological egoism is that ethical egoism is a claim about how people ought to act. I should change the words there. There we go. Ought to act. Okay, start over again. The main difference between ethical egoism and psychological egoism is that ethical egoism is a claim about how people ought to act, and psychological egoism is a claim about how people actually act. A, true. B, false. All right, so we've had 3 study questions. In just a little bit, I'll tell you what the answers to the 3 study questions were. So let's start wrapping it up here. So in this lecture, I've talked about 4 things. We started off talking about kinds of norms, and you should know now the difference between ethical norms and non-ethical norms. And then we talked about 3 kinds of approaches to ethics, all of which I suggested are kinds of relativism. There's egoism, social relativism, and divine command theory. And I emphasize the way in which they made things relative to people's opinions or judgments. Egoism makes it relative to the individual people. Social relativism makes it relative to groups of people. And divine command theory makes it relative to special people, maybe the most special person of all, God. Nonetheless, each of these views is making ethics a mere matter of judgment, and it removes the possibility of criticizing those judgments. If those judgments make morality true, then there's no reason you can ask about why those things are true. Okay, so lecture 4 was about these 3 relativistic approaches to ethics. In lectures 5, 6, and 7, each of those are going to be dedicated to something we should view as being non-relativistic. These are going to be attempts to give some kind of objective grounding to morality. They're going to be secular. That means they're going to be non-religious, but also they're attempting to be objective, or in other words, non-relativistic. So we're going to spend the whole of lecture 5 talking about something called utilitarianism, and then lecture 6 is talking about the ethics of the philosopher Kant, Immanuel Kant. That's Kantianism. And then lecture 7 we're going to talk about virtue ethics. Okay, let's take a look at the answers to the study questions from today's lectures. The answer to question 1 was D. The answer to question 2 was also D. And the answer to question 3 was A. And that brings us to the end of lecture 4. Thank you for watching this video, and until next time, keep it philosophical. All right, I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.